In today's video, we're going to talk about all the dividend increases that were announced in the last week. And believe it or not, there were 69 increases. There were a handful of share buybacks. There was one company that's actually suspending their dividend and another that offered a special dividend. So we're going to start right here with Cincinnati Financial, and they are raising their quarterly dividend by 8.7%. They'll have a forward yield of 2.85%, going ex-dividend on March 16th with a pay date on April 14th. Next up is Alliance Resource Partners, and they're raising their quarterly dividend by 40%, giving them a forward yield of 15.52%. They'll go ex-dividend coming up on February 6th with a pay date on February 14th. First Business Financial Services is raising their quarterly dividend by 15.2%, and they've announced a $5 million buyback program. They'll have a forward yield of 2.63%, go ex-dividend on February 3rd, and have a pay date on February 16th. Next up is Eagle Financial Bancorp, and they are raising their quarterly dividend by 14.3%, giving them a forward yield of 1.78%. They'll go ex-dividend on February 14th with a pay date on February 28th. River City Bank is raising their dividend by 6.1%, giving them a forward yield of 0.58%. They'll go ex-dividend on February 6th with a pay date on February 21st. GATX is raising their dividend by 5.8%, giving them a forward yield of 1.94%. They'll go ex-dividend on March 2nd with a pay date on March 31st. Ventura Financial is raising their dividend by 11.1%, giving them a forward yield of 1.74%. They go ex-dividend coming up at the end of this week on February 3rd with a pay date on February 13th. A couple of different announcements from New Star Energy. The first one is New Star Energy LP 9%, and they have announced a dividend increase of 29.1%, giving them a forward yield of 11.64%. They'll go ex-dividend on February 28th with a pay date on March 15th. The next New Star Energy is New Star Energy LP, and they've announced a dividend increase of 13.7%, giving them a forward yield of 11.3%. They'll go ex-dividend on February 28th with a pay date on March 15th. And the last New Star Energy is New Star Energy LP PFD Unit Series A, and they are raising their dividend by 12.2%, giving them a forward yield of 11.47%. They'll go ex-dividend, just like the others, on February 28th with a pay date on March 15th. And here we are at People's Financial Services, and they've announced an increase in their dividend by 2.5%, giving them a forward yield of 3.23%. They'll go ex-dividend on February 27th with a pay date on March 15th. Community West Bancshares announced a raise in their dividend by 6.7%, which gets you a whole 8 cents for each share that you own. Their forward yield is 2.17%, and they'll go ex-dividend on February 9th with a pay date on February 28th. And we've got a 50% dividend increase from Nexstar Media, giving them a forward yield of 2.75%. They'll go ex-dividend on February 9th with a pay date on February 24th. American Express announced a dividend increase of 15.4%, giving them a forward yield of 1.45%. And this actually is going to go into effect beginning with the first quarter 2023 dividend declaration. Arch Rock is raising their quarterly dividend by 3.4%, giving them a forward yield of 6.37%. They'll go ex-dividend on February 6th with a pay date on February 14th. We have a 5.8% increase from Alliant Energy, giving them a yield of 3.32%. They'll go ex-dividend coming up on January 30th with a pay date on February 15th. Smart Financial announced a raise in their dividend by 14.3%, giving them a forward yield of 1.21%. They'll go ex-dividend on February 9th with a pay date on February 27th. Hilltop is raising their dividend by 6.7%, giving them a forward yield of 2.11%. They'll go ex-dividend on February 9th with a pay date on February 24th. Wintrust Financial announced a whopping 17.6% increase from their prior dividend, giving them a forward yield of 1.77%. They'll go ex-dividend on February 8th with a pay date on February 23rd. CB Financial Services is raising their dividend by 4.2%, giving them a forward yield of 4.63%. They'll go ex-dividend on February 14th with a pay date on February 28th. Air Products and Chemicals is a dividend aristocrat with 40 years of dividend increase, and this time they're giving us an extra 8%, giving them a forward yield of 2.21%. They're going to go ex-dividend on March 31st with a pay date on May 8th. FS Bancorp is giving a dividend increase of 25%, pushing that forward yield to 2.95%. They're going to go ex-dividend on February 8th with a pay date on February 23rd. Energy Transfer has announced a raise in their dividend by 15.1%, giving them a forward yield of 9.24%. They'll go ex-dividend on February 6th with a pay date on February 21st. FB Financial has announced an increase in their dividend by 15.4%, giving them a forward yield of 1.65. They go ex-dividend on February 6th with a payday on February 21st. Applied Industrial Technologies is raising their dividend by 2.9%, giving them a forward yield of 1.14%. They'll go ex-dividend on February 14th with a payday on the 28th. Hancock Whitney is raising their dividend by 11.1%. They'll have a forward yield of 2.46% and go ex-dividend on March 3rd with a payday on March 15th. And the board authorized a stock buyback program where they may, from time to time, purchase up to 4,297,000 shares of its outstanding common stock. SJW is raising their dividend by 5.6%, giving them a forward yield of 1.94%. They'll go ex-dividend February 3rd with a payday on March 1st. A couple different pieces of news coming from Truxton this week, and the first is that they're raising their dividend by 11.8%. They're also offering a special dividend of $1 and a $5 million share repurchase program. Their forward yield will be 2.17%. They'll go ex-dividend on March 9th, and a payday is going to be on March 24th. And we've got a whopping 20% increase in that dividend from East West Bancorp, giving them a forward yield of 2.79%. They're going to go ex-dividend February 3rd with a payday on February 21st. Heritage Financial is raising their dividend by 4.8%. Forward yield is 3.12%. They're going to go ex-dividend February 7th with a payday on February 22nd. Blackstone announced a 1.1% dividend increase, giving them a forward yield of 4.1%. They go ex-dividend February 3rd with a payday on February 13th. Comcast is raising their dividend by 7.4%, giving them a forward yield of 2.89%. They'll go ex-dividend April 4th with a payday on April 26th. Archer Daniels Midland is boosting their dividend by 12.5%. This dividend aristocrat has been increasing their dividend for 47 years, and they've done it again. They've got a forward yield of 2.1%. They go ex-dividend February 8th and have a payday on March 2nd. Murphy Oil has announced a 10% increase in their dividend, giving them a forward yield right now of 2.57%. They go ex-dividend February 10th with a payday on March 1st. S&T Bancorp is raising their dividend by 3.2%, giving them a forward yield of 3.97%. They'll go ex-dividend February 9th, payday on February 23rd. And we are just about halfway there, and if you are still with me, you are committed to your dividends, and I love you for it. But here we are at First Bank Shares. They're raising their dividend by 5%, giving them a forward yield of 2.79%. They'll go ex-dividend on February 7th, with a pay date on the 24th. Home Bank Shares is raising their quarterly dividend by 9.1%. Forward yield is at 3.21%. Ex-dividend date is coming up on February 14th, and the pay date on March 8th. Cadence Bank has announced a 6.8% increase to their dividend. Forward yield is at 3.77%. Ex-dividend date on the 14th of March with a pay date on April 3rd. We've got a 10% increase in the dividend from OFG Bancorp, and they have a forward yield of 3.24. Ex-dividend date on March 30th with pay date on April 17th. We've got a 3.8% dividend yield from Unitil, and the forward yield is 3.13%. Ex-dividend on February 13th with pay date on February 28th. Marathon Oil, much like the marathon of dividend increases this week, is increasing their dividend by 11.1%. The forward yield is at 1.44%. Ex-dividend on February 14th with a pay date on March 10th. Arthur J. Gallagher is raising their dividend by 7.8%. Forward yield is at 1.12%. Ex-dividend on March 2nd with a pay date on March 17th. We've got a 25% increase to the dividend from Hexcel with a forward yield of 0.8%. Ex-dividend on February 9th with a pay date on February 17th. Oakview Bank Shares is actually increasing their dividend by 100%. The forward yield is at 1.17%. Ex-dividend on January 27th with a pay date on February 6th. Jacobs Engineering is raising their dividend by 13%, and they authorized a share repurchase program with the purchase of up to $1 billion of Jacobs common stock. They'll go ex-dividend on February 23rd with a pay date on March 24th. Princeton Bancorp Incorporated is raising their dividend by 20%. The forward yield is 3.69%. Ex-dividend on February 9th with a pay date on March 3rd. Bentley System is raising their quarterly dividend by 66.7%, giving them a forward yield of 0.53%. They'll go ex-dividend on February 17th with a pay date on March 7th. Kimberly-Clark, Dividend King, is raising their dividend by 1.7%. The forward yield is at 3.62%. They're going to go ex-dividend on March 9th with a pay date on April 4th. Harleysville Savings Financial is raising their dividend by 3.4%. Forward yield is at 4.8%. They'll go ex-dividend February 7th with a pay date on February 22nd. We've got a 5.9% increase coming out of S&P Global, and they are a dividend aristocrat as well with 49 years of dividend increases. They're going to go ex-dividend on February 23rd with a pay date on March 10th. Penske Automotive is raising their dividend by 7%. Forward yield is at 2.09%. They'll go ex-dividend on February 9th with a pay date on March 1st. Elevance Health is raising their dividend by 15.6%. Forward yield is at 1.24% right now. They're going to go ex-dividend on March 9th with a pay date on March 24th. Stifel Financial is raising their dividend by 20%. Forward yield is at 2.29%. Ex-dividend date is February 28th with a pay date on March 15th. We have a 4.8% dividend increase coming out of One Gas. Their forward yield is 3.29%. Ex-dividend date on February 23rd with a pay date on March 10th. Norfolk Southern is raising their dividend by 8.9%. The forward yield is at 2.11%. Ex-dividend date coming up on February 2nd with a pay date on February 21st. We've got a 7.8% increase coming out of Canadian National Railway, giving them a forward yield of 1.9%. Ex-dividend date is on March 9th with a pay date on March 31st. And the company can repurchase for cancellation up to 32 million shares over the next 12 months. And that brings us to Premier Financial, who's raising their dividend by 3.3%. The forward yield is at 4.57%. They'll go ex-dividend on February 9th with a pay date on February 17th. Home Bancorp is raising their dividend by 4.2%. The forward yield is 2.55%. They'll go ex-dividend on February 3rd with a pay date on February 17th. Cambridge Bancorp is raising their dividend by 4.7%. The forward yield is at 3.21%. They'll go ex-dividend February 8th with pay date on February 23rd. Halliburton is lifting their dividend by 33.3%. Forward yield is at 1.58%. They go ex-dividend February 28th with a pay date on March 29th. Timberland Bancorp is raising their dividend by 4.5%. Forward yield is at 2.76%. Ex-dividend date coming up on February 9th with a pay date on February 24th. Hess Midstream Partners is raising their quarterly dividend by 1.2%. Forward yield is at 7.16%. Ex-dividend date coming up on February 1st with a pay date on February 13th. Delek Logistics Partners is raising their dividend by 3%. Forward yield is at 8.49%. Ex-dividend on February 1st with a pay date on February 9th. Share owners of Heartland Bancorp has just received a raise of 10% to their dividend. Forward yield is at 3.04%. Ex-dividend March 24th with a pay date on April 10th. Citizens Community Bancorp is increasing their dividend by 11.5%. Forward yield is at 2.37%. Ex-dividend on February 2nd with a pay date on February 17th. Simmons First National is raising their dividend by 5.3%. We've got a forward yield of 3.47%. Ex-dividend on March 14th with a pay date on April 3rd. Community Heritage Financial is raising their dividend by 50%. Forward yield is at 1.2%. Ex-dividend February 2nd with a pay date on February 10th. And the last of the increases comes from Franklin Electric, and they are increasing their dividend by 15%. Forward yield at 1.06%. Ex-dividend February 1st, pay date on February 16th. We've got some share buybacks to talk about, and we're going to start here with United Rentals. And you can see here they're actually just initiating a dividend of $1.48 per share. It's going to be quarterly. The forward yield is 1.51%. That ex-dividend date is on February 7th with a pay date on February 22nd. And something else of note is that URI said it plans to begin the $1 billion stock repurchase under the program in the first quarter of this year. In other news, BlackRock has declared a 2.4% dividend increase with a forward yield of 2.67%, and the board of directors also authorized the repurchase of an additional $7 million under the company's existing share repurchase program for a total of up to approximately 7.9 million shares of BlackRock common stock. Lots to talk about with Chevron. We've got a 6.3% dividend increase. They're going to go ex-dividend on February 15th. Pay date's going to be March 10th. And the board also authorized the repurchase of the company's shares of common stock in an aggregate amount of $75 billion effective April 1st, and it doesn't have a fixed expiration date. Forward yield is at 3.37%. Liberty Energy announced this week that it's increasing its existing share repurchase authorization to $500 million, which is a $250 million hike from the original authorized amount. And our last piece of news today comes from Silvergate Capital, who is suspending their preferred stock dividend to hold on to some of their cash. Now, if you made it this far, you're committed, and I appreciate that. So I hope you enjoyed it. Now go take a peek at this video next.